Is your employer permitted to provide you with working notice instead of a severance package? I'm Mike from Cashion Legal, and in this video, I'll provide the answer to that question, along with additional information about your rights during a working notice period. At the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of what working notice is and what you can do if your employer has provided you with working notice of the termination of your employment. Generally speaking, people expect to receive severance packages upon termination of employment. Even though this is the common expectation, technically employers are required to provide advance notice of termination and not a severance package. The severance payments that people often receive are actually intended to provide the people with compensation that they would have earned had they worked through their notice period. So while severance payments are much more common than working notice, employers are allowed to fulfill their obligations to employees by providing advance notice of termination. In my view, there are a few practical reasons why employers generally provide severance instead of advance notice. For example, letting someone know that their employment will be terminated at a future date could be generally awkward and decrease morale within the workplace. Additionally, it's also reasonable to expect that if someone knows that their employment will be terminated at a future date, they might not work to the fullest of their abilities. Regardless, there are some situations where employers prefer to provide advance notice, and sometimes they do. If your employer has informed you of the termination of your employment and provided you with advance working notice of termination instead of severance, there are a few key things you should know. Firstly, some employees are technically entitled to some amount of severance, and that depends on the terms of your employment contract. So if you find yourself in this situation, I would encourage you to review your employment contract either by yourself or with a lawyer to determine whether you're entitled to any severance payments in addition to the working notice. Secondly, you should know that an employer cannot change the terms of your employment during the working notice period. In Alberta, once an employee is informed of the termination of their employment, changes to employment are expressly prohibited by Alberta's Employment Standards Code. Also, if your employer makes substantial changes during the working notice period, these changes may constitute a constructive dismissal. For that reason, during the working notice period, an employer cannot make substantial changes to your pay, your working environment, your responsibilities, or your role. If your employer has made substantial changes to any of these things during the working notice period, you may be entitled to resign and pursue a claim for constructive dismissal. Thirdly, it's also important to note that working notice does not necessarily eliminate a wrongful dismissal claim. So wrongful dismissal claims are generally focused on whether the employee has received sufficient notice or pay in lieu of notice. So if your employer has provided you with insufficient working notice, you may still have a claim for additional pay in lieu of notice based on the insufficient working notice period. Finally, if you wish to pursue a wrongful dismissal claim against your employer, your obligation to mitigate your damages continues during the working notice period. The obligation to mitigate your damages requires employees who are pursuing wrongful dismissal claims to make reasonable efforts to search for alternate comparable employment. If you have been informed of the termination of your employment by your employer and you're working out during a working notice period, you still have an obligation to make reasonable efforts to mitigate your damages while you remain employed with your current employer. If you make insufficient efforts to mitigate your damages, even during a working notice period, this may reduce the quantum of your wrongful dismissal claim. If you have been recently informed of the termination of your employment and your employer has asked you to work through the working notice period, do not hesitate to contact our office today to book a consultation.